You've probably heard the name whispered in dark corridors and forbidden corners of conversation, a name so heavy with fear that even the air seems to tighten when it's spoken. But before the world trembled at the mention of Lord Voldemort, there was simply a boy, born under a curse that was never his choosing. It's 1926. The air in London hangs thick with the residue of coal smoke and damp winter fog, and inside a dim, forgotten hospital ward, a woman named Merope Gaunt gives birth to a child she will never see grow. The walls smell faintly of disinfectant and sorrow, and outside, a stray cat yowls as if announcing that something unnatural has just entered the world. The boy doesn't cry much. He simply stares, as if the act of living is already something he's considering carefully. You might think that's an exaggeration, but you probably won't survive realizing just how many dark legacies begin quietly, wrapped in blankets and neglect. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The nurses who tend to him whisper that his mother muttered strange words before dying, clutching a locket so tightly that the metal left marks in her skin. One claims the locket bore a crest, a serpent coiled around the letter S. Another insists it was simply a cheap trinket, the kind sold by peddlers outside Diagon Alley. No one ever confirms either story, but the boy grows, and with him, a quiet unease. He doesn't smile, he doesn't laugh. By age 3, other children learn to avoid him, though they can't explain why. There's a story about a rat that vanished after biting his hand, another about a caretaker who refused to enter his room after hearing a hiss that didn't sound quite human. You sit with the image of this small, pale child in your mind, a creature both fragile and unknowable. Imagine the loneliness of an orphanage where kindness is rationed like bread, where the fire burns too low in winter and too hot in summer. History books rarely linger on the details of what it means to be unwanted, but here, those details matter. Tom Riddle grows up surrounded by cracked walls and older children who mock his silence. Yet he watches them, studies them, learning which words hurt most and which glances make others back away. One of the nurses, a weary woman named Mrs. Cole, once writes in her records that the boy seems off. Her handwriting trails into smudged ink, as though she couldn't bring herself to finish. It's a simple observation, but historians still argue over what off meant in this context. Some say it referred to an early sign of magical aptitude, accidental magic caused by stress. Others, more skeptical, claim it was merely the result of trauma, a child's way of asserting control in a world where he had none. There's even a fringe theory that Merope Gaunt's death curse lingered in his blood, shaping his temperament long before he could speak. You'll have to decide which explanation suits you best, though none make his story any less chilling. On rainy days, Tom sits near the orphanage window, tracing shapes on the fogged glass, sometimes faces, sometimes symbols that no one recognizes. Once, a thunderclap startles the children, and a vase shatters across the room without being touched. He doesn't flinch. He only stares at the shards, almost satisfied. If you lean close enough, you can imagine the faint hum of something awakening beneath his skin, the way magic sometimes pulses through those who don't yet understand it. There's a peculiar charm in tragedy when seen from a distance, isn't there? You might even feel sympathy, until you realize that sympathy is what Tom Riddle learned to mimic before he learned to feel. Every scraped knee, every insult, every moment of dismissal hardened him into something less like a child and more like an idea, cold, deliberate, patient. Some say darkness is inherited, that it seeps down bloodlines like an old curse. Others insist it's learned, born from circumstance and cruelty. Whichever side you believe, this is where that debate begins. In a cold room, with a quiet boy staring out into the rain, already dreaming of a world where he will never be powerless again.
The nights at Wool's orphanage are long and heavy, filled with the muffled coughing of children and the creak of old wood settling under the weight of secrets. You walk the dim corridor now, the smell of boiled cabbage clinging to the air, and at the end of it, behind a door marked with a crooked R, lies the boy everyone avoids. The matron says he sleeps quietly, but no one believes her. Sometimes, the other children swear they hear whispering from his room, soft, deliberate, as if he's having conversations with someone who isn't there. And when they press their ears to the door, they claim to hear not words, but hissing, low and rhythmic, like the sound of wind through tall grass. You tell yourself it's imagination, the way children invent monsters to make sense of the dark. But in this case, the monster might be listening back.
Tom is 5 the first time he notices that he can make things happen, not the small, accidental bursts of magic that young witches and wizards experience, but controlled events, punishments disguised as coincidences. A bully who taunts him about his mother suddenly falls ill with a fever no doctor can explain. A toy soldier taken from his shelf reappears days later in the offender's bed, its painted face melted into a grotesque grin. When the staff discover it, Tom doesn't cry, doesn't defend himself. He just tilts his head, studying their fear with the detached curiosity of someone watching insects under glass. You might feel a shiver here, not because he's cruel, but because he's starting to enjoy the pattern of cause and effect. There's an old journal entry from a volunteer at the orphanage dated June 1931. It mentions, quite casually, that young Riddle shows a strange aptitude for manipulation, and then in parentheses adds, though he's far too clever for his age. Historians have argued over this line for decades. Was it evidence of natural intelligence, or the first glimpse of that otherworldly charm that would one day bend entire generations to his will? A few scholars even suggest that his charisma carried traces of legilimency, untrained mind reading that allowed him to mirror others' emotions before they even realized it themselves. The theory remains unproven, but when you imagine that small boy staring into the eyes of an adult and saying exactly what they want to hear, it's not so far-fetched. One afternoon, the matron finds Tom sitting in the cellar, surrounded by dead insects arranged in perfect spirals. When she asks what he's doing, he replies, "I'm teaching them to listen." It's the kind of answer that should make you laugh nervously until you realize he isn't joking. From that day on, the cellar door stays locked, and yet somehow the same spiral pattern begins to appear scratched into the floorboards near his bed, etched so faintly that you might mistake it for the work of mice. A fringe magical historian named Aurelius Bragg once argued that these spirals resembled an ancient parcel-tongue sigil used to summon attention from serpent spirits. Most others dismissed this as nonsense, but Bragg insists the boy's connection to snakes didn't begin with Hogwarts. It began here, in the damp dark below the orphanage, with whispers no one else could hear. Evenings bring a strange ritual. While other children play or pray before bed, Tom sits near the radiator, its heat groaning through rusted pipes. He holds small objects in his hands, pins, marbles, bits of metal, and focuses on them until they tremble. He calls it testing. Once, when a girl named Amy dares to snatch one from him, her hair turns white overnight. Coincidence, the nurses say. A prank gone wrong. But Amy leaves the orphanage within a month, her parents refusing to explain why. There's no official record, only a smudged note. Transferred. Nervous condition. You can almost hear the matron exhale in relief. It's strange, isn't it? How easily people overlook warning signs when they wear a child's face. Tom learns this lesson early. When adults scold him, he lowers his eyes and whispers an apology. When they praise him, he smiles just enough to seem sincere. But in the quiet moments, when no one's watching, he studies himself in the cracked mirror above his bed, turning his head side to side, whispering questions he already knows the answers to. The reflection, if you look closely, doesn't always move with him. You might want to believe that evil announces itself with thunder and lightning, but more often it begins with a polite boy thanking you for the soup. Some of the older orphans remember a winter night when Tom stood at the top of the stairs, motionless for hours, just watching the others sleep. They woke to find him gone, only to discover him in the courtyard moments later, staring at the frozen pond where the ice had split into perfect, symmetrical cracks, like the veins of a living creature. By the time he turned 7, the staff stopped trying to understand him. They give him books instead, old hand-me-downs with torn covers. He reads them all, Greek myths, fairy tales, even medical encyclopedias, absorbing them with the intensity of someone who doesn't just want to learn, but to surpass. It's in these pages that he first encounters the concept of immortality, not through magic, but through memory, through the idea that to be remembered is to never truly die. He tucks that thought away, a seed waiting for the right soil. You can almost see him now, a boy sitting in the flickering candlelight, his eyes glinting like polished obsidian, the faintest smile tugging at his lips as he whispers to himself. He doesn't yet know the name he'll one day claim, but he already senses it coiling within him, patient and inevitable. The air grows colder as he closes his book and snuffs the candle out with a single breath. Somewhere in the dark, something stirs, listening.
You descend the orphanage steps again, this time to the cold cellar where the real story begins. Not the legend of a dark lord, but the lonely hum of a child whispering to something only he can hear. It's the year 1933, and London's streets tremble with the echo of distant change. But down here, beneath the cracked foundation of Wool's orphanage, the world narrows to a patch of stone, a boy, and a single sound. The slow, deliberate hiss of language not meant for human ears. You crouch in the damp, feeling the chill creep up your spine as Tom Riddle traces patterns on the floor, murmuring in that strange, musical tone. The rats have stopped moving. Even the pipes, which usually groan like ghosts, fall silent. And then, from a shadowed corner, a serpent slithers into view. Thin, green, patient. It does not strike. It listens. For the first time in his life, Tom smiles. It's small, uncertain, but real. The snake seems to respond, coiling closer as if drawn by familiarity. When he speaks again, the sound that escapes his lips is smooth and natural, as though it's been waiting for years to be used. Parcel tongue. Language of serpents, language of Salazar Slytherin himself. Of course, Tom doesn't know that yet. To him, it's simply proof that he's not mad, that the whispers he's heard since birth aren't imagination. He feels chosen, special. The orphanage, with its dull rules and lukewarm porridge, can't contain him anymore. You can almost taste his exhilaration, the way discovery tastes when it's forbidden. In later years, magical historians would debate this first encounter endlessly. One camp, led by the rather severe Professor Cattermole of the Wizarding Historical Society, insists it was pure instinct, an early manifestation of inherited magic from the Gaunt bloodline. Another camp argues that the snake never existed at all, that Tom conjured it unconsciously, his power so raw it gave form to his isolation. A third, more eccentric scholar claims that Parseltongue isn't a learned skill or a genetic trait, but a spiritual echo, passed down from minds that once communed with magical creatures in a forgotten age. None agree on the truth, but all concede one thing. Something in that cellar changed the course of magical history. Tom begins to test his ability. He sneaks scraps of meat from the kitchen, lures small snakes from the riverbank, and hides them under the floorboards. When the matron discovers one, he shrugs, saying he likes to listen to the hissing. The other children laugh, but quietly, because strange things happen to those who laugh at Tom. Once, a boy named Dennis mocks him at lunch, mimicking a snake's hiss. The next day, Dennis's pet rabbit vanishes, only to reappear weeks later, frozen, perfectly preserved, in a jar behind the coal bins. No one can prove anything, of course. Tom's record remains spotless, his manners impeccable, but his eyes, when he's alone, gleam with the kind of curiosity that borders on worship. Sometimes he talks to the snakes about the other children. He describes their habits, their weaknesses, the ways they can be made to bend. The snakes never respond in words, but he swears they understand, their flickering tongues tasting his ambition like a secret flavor. And if you listen closely now, in this musty air, you might hear his laughter, not the sharp laugh of a villain, but the quiet, delighted giggle of a child realizing the world can be controlled if you learn its language. Years later, Dumbledore himself would recall this period as the point at which Tom Riddle began to believe he was more than human. You can imagine the future headmaster, standing years after the fact, poring over dusty records and muttering to himself, wondering what he could have done if he'd found the boy sooner. It's the classic debate, nature versus nurture. Could love have softened him? Could a family have diverted the path that led to Voldemort? You already know the answer. It's the one no one likes to say aloud. Some souls are born carrying an echo of something ancient, something that doesn't crave affection but obedience.
By the time Tom turns 9, the orphanage staff have stopped calling him Tommy. They use his full name, like a spell they don't want to miscast. Tom Riddle. It rings through the corridors like the toll of a small, ominous bell. When visitors arrive to inspect the home, Tom behaves perfectly, answering questions with calm precision, even charming them with his intelligence. The matron calls him her cleverest boy, though she never meets his gaze for more than a second. There's a story she tells the other adults after a glass or two of sherry. Once, she found Tom sitting cross-legged on his bed, a small snake curled around his wrist. When she gasped and reached for a broom, he looked up and said, "Don't worry, miss. It's only listening." She never forgot how calm his voice sounded, how convincing. If this were an ordinary tale, this might be the moment when you'd hope for rescue, some kindly wizard to appear, take his hand, and lead him toward light. But this isn't that kind of story. This is the slow, quiet birth of something the world isn't ready for. Tom Riddle doesn't want saving. He wants understanding. He wants to know why the world works the way it does, and more importantly, how to make it kneel. So here in the damp dark, with the sound of hissing echoing softly against the stones, you realize this isn't a haunted cellar. It's a nursery, not for snakes, but for an idea, one that will one day call itself Lord Voldemort. There's something strange about mirrors, isn't there? The way they pretend to tell the truth, yet always seem to hold a second opinion. You find yourself standing in front of the cracked one above Tom Riddle's narrow bed, its surface fogged with the breath of countless orphans before him, and you notice, if only for a second, that his reflection doesn't always move when he does. It's subtle at first, a blink out of sync, a smile that lingers half a beat too long. Maybe it's the dim light, maybe just your imagination, but you wouldn't be the first to think something was wrong with that mirror. Years later, when the orphanage was torn down, the construction workers swore that the glass refused to break, no matter how many hammers they used. They said it looked almost alive, shimmering faintly, as though remembering the boy who used to stare into it. At age 10, Tom begins what you might call his private experiments. Not potions, not spells. He doesn't yet have the means for that. But psychological tests of control. He starts with reflections. Each night, after the lights go out, he sits up in bed, watching himself in the glass. He practices facial expressions, rehearses empathy the way an actor rehearses lines, teaching his reflection to smile on command. One night, though, something changes. The air turns heavy, like the moment before a storm. The flickering candlelight stretches across the walls, and in that fragile in-between, the reflection smiles before he does. Just slightly, enough for his breath to catch. Enough to make him whisper, "Who are you?" And for the briefest instant, the reflection seems to whisper back. Now you could dismiss this as a child's imagination, sleep deprivation, emotional trauma, a trick of light. In fact, modern magical psychologists still argue about it. The phantom reflection hypothesis, proposed in 1978 by Dr. Melina Thorne, suggests that young witches and wizards with intense magical energy sometimes project subconscious echoes of themselves, visible only in mirrors or glass. Others say it's nonsense, a romanticized myth meant to explain childhood loneliness. But there's a more unsettling theory, whispered in darker circles, that what Tom saw wasn't himself at all, but something drawn to him, something that recognized the void forming where love should have been. He becomes fascinated with the idea that identity is fluid, that maybe the self is just another mask, one you can rearrange if you're clever enough. He tests this in small ways, mimicking voices, changing his posture, convincing teachers that he's ill just to skip chores. Each successful lie becomes fuel for the larger one he's building inside, that he is more than ordinary, more than human. You watch him sitting by the window on a gray afternoon, light spilling across his face like tarnished silver, and you realize he's learning to perform normalcy the way a magician performs misdirection, by making you look in the wrong place. The other children sense it. They stop teasing him. They start avoiding mirrors too. A girl named Esther claims she saw two sets of eyes staring out from his reflection one night, one his and one older, colder, almost reptilian. The matron laughs it off, but that same week, Esther is transferred to another home. The official reason? Recurring nightmares. Funny how paperwork never tells the whole story. Still, Tom finds comfort in his reflection. He begins confiding in it, whispering secrets he'd never dare share with another soul. He talks about power, about the way people cling to rules to disguise their weakness, about how the world feels wrong, disordered, and how someone clever enough might fix it. He doesn't realize yet that he's feeding a shadow, one that's listening as much as it's being formed. Sometimes, while he studies his own face, he wonders what his parents looked like. Mrs. Cole tells him his mother was delicate, quiet, not well in the head. About his father, she says nothing, only that he was handsome and cruel. Tom doesn't believe in silence without purpose. If she won't tell him, he'll find out himself. The reflection seems to approve, smiling when he says the words aloud. I'll find them. Outside, London grows darker with the creeping shadow of war. Radios buzz with fear. The orphanage windows are sealed against drafts and bomb sirens. But down here, in his little room, Tom Riddle is discovering something that frightens even him. The realization that fear can be turned outward, used like a blade. He begins experimenting with small acts of control, watching how others react when he offers comfort or threat. To his surprise, kindness often unsettles people more than cruelty. He files that away like a lesson learned. You can almost see him now, standing before that cracked mirror, the candle flickering low, the walls humming faintly with the tension of something unspeakable forming. He raises his hand. The reflection raises it too, but this time, there's a faint shimmer between them, like heat off pavement. A current of magic, or maybe madness. He whispers, "You'll see." They'll all see, and somewhere in the depths of the glass, something seems to smile back, not as his equal, but as his audience. Historians often call this period the birth of the idea of Voldemort. But that's far too simple. This wasn't the birth of a villain. It was the moment a child learned that his reflection would never abandon him. And for someone who had been left by everyone else, that was enough. You wake before dawn, the castle still and breathing softly, its torches reduced to faint embers that flicker like sleeping eyes, and you follow Tom Riddle down the narrow stone corridors to the Slytherin dormitory where the air smells faintly of damp stone and secrecy. Beneath his bed lies a simple wooden box, plain, unremarkable, but locked with a charm so complex even a seventh-year student wouldn't unravel it. This is the first of his hidden trophies, though calling them trophies feels too childish. They are testaments, proof that he can control what others cannot. Inside are trinkets, small tokens from classmates and strangers alike. A silver ring, a stray quill, a strand of hair wrapped in cloth. Each one represents a moment of victory, not through violence, but through influence. He doesn't keep them for sentiment. He keeps them to remember who once owed him something. You can almost hear him whisper as he arranges them. Power is practice. By now, his charm has become legendary. Professors describe him as a model student, courteous and insightful, while students whisper that he knows things no teenager should. Rumors swirl that he can make you confess secrets with a single stare, and though no one can prove it, few are willing to test the theory twice. His voice is measured, soothing, never raised. His laughter rare, but well-timed. He's learned that trust is a spell more potent than any incantation, and he wields it with surgical precision. One evening, he's caught by Professor Slughorn after curfew, sitting in the potions classroom surrounded by open vials and flickering candlelight. Slughorn, indulgent as ever, laughs it off. "Brilliant boy, just curious." But Dumbledore sees it differently. He visits Tom the next day, his expression grave. "Curiosity," he warns, "can open doors best left closed." Tom tilts his head and replies, "But Professor, what's the point of having doors if not to open them?" It's the kind of cleverness adults mistake for wit instead of warning. The most intriguing piece in that box under his bed is a diary, leather-bound, worn at the edges, its pages empty. At least, they look empty. He writes in it every night, whispering to it as though to an old friend. When asked about it, he smiles and says it helps him remember himself. Later historians, particularly Ilara Tyne of the Magical Memory Institute, would suggest this was his first experiment with the concept of preserving one's essence through writing, a proto-horcrux of thought, if not of soul. Fringe scholars even argue that the diary might have been enchanted far earlier than anyone realized, that the act of chronicling his intentions was itself an attempt to divide the burden of conscience from memory. The mainstream community, of course, rejects this, but they can't explain why, decades later, the diary would still hold his voice. You might wonder how such darkness grows unnoticed in a place filled with magic and wisdom. But Hogwarts is an old castle. It has secrets older than compassion. The portraits gossip, the ghosts observe, and the walls keep everything they hear. One night, while everyone else sleeps, Tom walks the halls barefoot, candle in hand, tracing the stone with his fingers. He listens for the faint hum beneath the surface, the ancient pulse of enchantments laid by the founders themselves. When he finds a patch of wall that vibrates slightly beneath his touch, he smiles. He's found a voice that whispers back. From this moment, he begins searching not just for knowledge, but for history, his own. He questions professors about Salazar Slytherin, about bloodlines, about whether magic can be diluted by love. Some dismiss his inquiries as academic ambition. Others sense something more and avoid him. Still, he compiles names, dates, and relics in that diary, filling the empty pages with the slow architecture of his new self. It's not enough to belong to Slytherin. He wants to become it. By 15, the charm has become art. He knows how to make teachers beam with pride and how to make rivals stumble with a single insinuation. His eyes gleam whenever someone says gifted. He collects admiration like currency, trading it for access. He knows which students will follow, which will fear, which will disappear quietly when told. A few older Slytherins joke about starting a club devoted to blood purity. Tom doesn't laugh, but he listens. Then he refines their nonsense into something cleaner, colder, and far more convincing. Not just purity, but destiny. And yet, every night, he returns to that little box, unlocking it slowly, touching each object with quiet reverence. You might think he's sentimental, but look closer. What he's really doing is measuring his progress. Each item is a chapter in the story he's writing. The evolution of Tom Riddle into something else entirely. Sometimes he holds the diary close and whispers, "We'll remember them all, won't we?" The diary, of course, doesn't answer, or perhaps it does, in a way no one else could hear. There's a strange comfort in the pattern he's built. Win admiration, gather relics, conceal evidence, repeat. Power is habit, and habit feels safe. And though he doesn't yet know it, he's already begun dividing himself, not magically, but spiritually, into fragments of identity. The boy, the scholar, the charmer, the collector. Each role is a mask, and behind them all is the same expression, hunger disguised as calm. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of his mother's last breath, the quiet inheritance of a curse passed through blood and silence. Tom Riddle may still look like a boy sitting in candlelight, but his shadow on the wall is no longer human. It stretches farther than the flame should allow. It begins, as all dangerous things do, with curiosity disguised as discovery. The castle has been whispering to him for years, softly, through pipes and echoes, in a tongue that only he can hear. And now, in his 5th year, Tom Riddle decides to answer it. You follow him through the dim corridors beneath the castle, torchlight trembling along the damp stone, each step echoing like a heartbeat. The trail leads to a forgotten stretch of wall deep in the dungeons, where the air smells faintly of mold and magic. He pauses, palm pressed flat against the stone, eyes half closed. And then, with the calm certainty of someone who already knows the answer, he hisses a single word. The wall moves, the castle exhales, and the chamber of secrets opens. The sound is low and wet, like stone grinding against bone, and the air that seeps out is older than language. You can almost taste the centuries, dust, serpents, bloodlines, and the faint metallic tang of ambition. The torchlight flickers across the massive pillars carved with serpents that seem to ripple in the dark, and there, at the far end, stands the statue of Salazar Slytherin himself, long-bearded, austere, his eyes carved in patient disdain. Tom steps forward reverently, whispering in Parseltongue, his voice blending with the hissing of unseen creatures. It's the closest thing to prayer he's ever spoken. When the basilisk stirs for the first time in centuries, the sound is almost gentle, a low vibration that rattles the dust loose from the ceiling. Tom doesn't flinch. He feels no fear, only recognition. The serpent coils through the darkness, vast and coiling like the embodiment of his own will. He speaks, it listens. 2 ancient forces, one born of stone and one of silence, finding each other across the abyss of time. The basilisk's slit-pupiled eyes remain half-lidded, but even that narrow gaze sends cracks through the floor. And Tom, impossibly, smiles. Of course, what happens next becomes legend. The mysterious attacks, the petrified students, the death of one poor girl whose ghost still wanders the bathroom where it all began. But the truth is quieter, crueler. Tom doesn't kill from rage or hatred. He kills from experiment. He wants to see what happens when death obeys him. Later, when the ministry investigates, the trail leads nowhere. His reputation remains untarnished, his charm intact. The only record of suspicion lies in a single line from Dumbledore's private notes. There is something about Riddle that watches when it should listen. Historians still argue about that line. Some interpret it as evidence of possession, that perhaps the boy was channeling something older, a remnant of Slytherin himself. Others argue the opposite, that Tom was entirely himself, and that was the problem. A few fringe theorists even suggest that Hogwarts itself, as an ancient magical organism, responded to his hunger like a mirror reflecting its observer. It's a debate that still unsettles scholars, especially those who teach in the castle today. After the chamber incident, Tom hides the diary beneath his pillow and begins writing not confessions, but reflections. I learned something today, one entry reads. Monsters are loyal when treated as equals. Another says, power is not granted, it is remembered. You can picture him writing it by candlelight, his shadow stretching long across the dormitory floor. When he's finished, he seals the diary shut and whispers, "We did well." It's unclear whether the "we" refers to him and the basilisk, or him and something else entirely. The following year, the school celebrates him for bravery. Imagine that, a murderer receiving awards for service. The irony isn't lost on him. He attends the ceremony with polite smiles, bowing when required, his gaze flicking toward Dumbledore with faint amusement. The world is absurd, he thinks, full of people desperate to believe goodness can be measured by applause. He files that lesson away too. Evenings find him wandering again, deeper into the castle's veins. He learns to move like the serpents he commands, silent, smooth, patient. In the dark, the walls sometimes whisper fragments of what might be prophecies. The air will rise, the house remembers, the child of shadow shall master death. He listens carefully, never asking who speaks. Maybe he already knows. You might want to hate him here, to see this as the moment where choice ended and corruption began, but it's never that simple. He's still a boy, barely 16, driven by the same emptiness that began in that orphanage room. Every spell he masters, every secret he uncovers, is just another attempt to fill it. The tragedy is that the more knowledge he gains, the deeper the hollow becomes. And so, night after night, he writes in the diary. Sometimes he records facts about Hogwarts, sometimes memories, sometimes nothing but single words. Control. Fear. Forever. When the ink dries, he stares at it, then at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. You'll never be forgotten, he tells himself softly. And somewhere in the castle, a faint hiss answers, echoing the promise back to him. It is one thing to discover that you are special, and quite another to decide that no one else is. By his final years at Hogwarts, Tom Riddle has stopped pretending to be ordinary altogether. You watch him walk through the corridors now, like a shadow stitched into daylight, his robes immaculate, his voice measured, his every gesture deliberate. The other students whisper his name with reverence, not fear, but he can tell the difference, and it disappoints him. Respect born from admiration feels cheap compared to the sharp, satisfying silence that comes from intimidation. He's outgrown praise. He wants permanence. You can sense it in his movements. He's no longer learning magic. He's dissecting it. The textbooks are too light, the teachers too kind, and even Hogwarts itself feels too small to contain the weight of his ambition. By now, he has begun to seek knowledge that even the library hides. Behind the shelves in the restricted section, where the dust is thick enough to remember the names of its readers, he finds Magic Mosta Avil, a book that does not sit still when opened. Inside are whispers about dividing the soul to avoid death, about vessels that anchor existence, Horcruxes. The word alone feels alive, heavy, wrong. Tom reads it again and again, tracing the letters with one fingertip. The text warns that creating such an object requires an act of supreme evil. He pauses, considering, not in horror, but curiosity. What exactly qualifies as supreme evil, he wonders, and who decided that was the standard? When he questions Professor Slughorn about the concept, the man chuckles nervously, dismissing it as academic nonsense. But Tom presses, gently, his tone almost innocent. Surely, sir, he says, you must have wondered if a fragment of a soul could survive. Wouldn't that be a kind of immortality? Slughorn stammers, changes the subject, but his eyes betray fear. That's all the confirmation Tom needs. Thank you, Professor, he says softly, and you can almost feel the chill that lingers in the room long after he leaves. Later, in his dormitory, he records the word in his diary. Horcrux, he writes, underlining it once. Then, I will not die. There's no flourish, no exclamation, just certainty. Historians would later call this the most consequential sentence ever written by a Hogwarts student, though few would ever see it. Fringe theorists like Cassia Kettleburn even argue that in this moment, Tom Riddle didn't merely study the concept of Horcruxes. He created the emotional blueprint for them, detaching empathy from mortality in one clean surgical thought. Still, even as he contemplates eternity, he remains obsessed with legacy. The diary, now enchanted, can respond. Its ink shifts like thought, reflecting his handwriting back at him. Sometimes, late at night, he writes questions and receives answers, his own words rearranged, reflected, sharpened. Are you afraid? He asks once. The diary replies, only of being forgotten. He smiles. Then we understand each other. Graduation comes with accolades. The faculty hail him as a prodigy destined for greatness. The ministry offers him a position he declines. Greatness, he believes, is not a title one accepts, it's a title one takes. And so he begins his quiet transformation, shaping himself into something the world has never seen before. He visits the gaunt shack in Little Hangleton, tracing his ancestry back through filth and ruin. He finds his uncle Morphin, broken, muttering, still clutching the family ring. When Tom leaves, Morphin is found unconscious, memory shattered, the ring missing. Officially, it's written off as another tragic episode in a long cursed family. Unofficially, the gaunt line ends that day, and the Riddle line with it, when Tom pays a visit to his Muggle father's estate and leaves only silence behind. There's an argument among magical historians about that night. The Ministry's version insists it was an act of revenge. Others say it was ritual, the creation of his first Horcrux. Either way, the result is the same. 3 dead bodies, and a boy whose heart beats quieter afterward. In his hand glints the gaunt ring, black stone shimmering with something alive. If you look closely, you can almost see his reflection in its surface, smaller, thinner, more hollow. From this point, he stops using his name. Tom Riddle feels like a cage, like a whisper of weakness. He spends weeks rearranging the letters on scraps of parchment, testing combinations until one feels right. "I am Lord Voldemort," he says aloud, and the sound is smooth, elegant, final. The orphan dies that night, not with a scream, but with a sigh. You can almost hear the echo fade into the walls of the empty dormitory, swallowed by the silence of the castle that once tried to raise him. Scholars debate whether this was the true birth of the Dark Lord or just the death of a boy who mistook isolation for destiny. But as you stand beside him in that candlelit room, watching his shadow stretch taller, darker, and thinner than the body that casts it, the distinction doesn't matter. For the first time, the reflection in the mirror smiles with him, not after him. And somewhere deep below the castle, the basilisk stirs again, sensing its master has finally learned how to shed his skin. They say every story ends where it began, and in a way, Tom Riddle's does too, in silence. But this is not the silence of peace or the gentle quiet of sleep. It's the stillness that follows when a storm has nothing left to destroy. You walk beside him now through the echoing corridors of Hogwarts one last time, long after he has left the school officially, but not in spirit. The torches burn low as he moves like a ghost returned home, his hand brushing the stone walls as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. He is no longer a student, no longer a man. He is a collection of decisions stacked like bones, held together by obsession and the refusal to end. The castle recognizes him. You can almost feel it shift, the old ward sighing as though resigned to the inevitable. He walks with purpose toward the dungeons, toward the place where his first whispers of power began, carrying the diary that still remembers him better than any person ever could. Each Horcrux he has made is a triumph carved out of fear. The ring, the locket, the cup, the diadem. Every act meant to anchor his existence has instead scattered him across the world like shards of broken glass. But he doesn't see that. To him, immortality isn't a curse. It's justice. The world failed him as a boy, and this is how he repays it, by refusing to die when it tells him to. In the years to come, he will build an army, forge a name, rewrite the rules of death itself. Yet in this moment, he stands alone, listening to the hum of the chamber below. He no longer opens it. He doesn't need to. The basilisk sleeps eternally, and he has learned that true control doesn't require constant motion, only the certainty that everything moves according to his will. He gazes into the mirror near the entrance, the same one where he once practiced smiling. The reflection now is warped, elongated, but the eyes remain the same, dark, clever, and utterly certain. For a long time, he simply watches. "You did it," he whispers, and the reflection nods back, hollow and triumphant. Dumbledore, somewhere in his office, feels the shift, that ripple in the air that always precedes a tragedy. He will later describe it as the moment he realized he had lost the boy completely. He no longer saw the world, Dumbledore will say in an interview decades later. only the pattern of how it could be bent. And perhaps that's true. But you know, having walked this far, that Tom Riddle never stopped seeing the world. He simply stopped seeing himself as part of it. Modern historians, ever desperate for moral symmetry, still argue about whether he could have been saved. Some claim that love, real love, would have broken the pattern. Others argue that fate had already written his script and no amount of affection could have erased the ink. A fringe scholar named Hollis Merriweather once proposed that Voldemort wasn't born evil at all, but became a reflection of the society that made him, fearful, hierarchical, obsessed with control. He is what happens, she wrote, when power is treated like affection and affection like weakness. It's not a comforting thought, but it's a human one. You follow him now up the final flight of stairs to the Great Hall. It's empty, echoing, moonlight spilling across the long tables like silver cloth. He pauses at the Slytherin table, runs a finger along its surface, and murmurs something you can't quite catch. It might be gratitude, it might be farewell. Then he turns toward the headmaster's chair, the one where Dumbledore will one day sit for the last time, and he imagines it differently. Darker, quieter, his. You can almost hear the future unraveling in his mind. He steps out into the night, and the wind off the lake carries the faintest trace of laughter. Not joyous, not cruel, just hollow. The boy who once wanted to belong has finally succeeded, in the most terrible way. He belongs to history now. And that brings us here, to you, sitting in the quiet, thinking about how a lonely child became a name the world fears to say aloud. The story of Tom Riddle isn't about magic or destiny. It's about what happens when emptiness learns to speak. When pain, given enough time and brilliance, learns to build a throne. So as the candles burn low and the night settles around you, take a deep breath. The story is over now. The orphan has found his forever silence, and the castle sleeps again. Somewhere, perhaps, a mirror still remembers his face. Now close your eyes. Let the wind hum through the dark like a lullaby. Imagine the echo of footsteps fading down a corridor that no longer exists. Everything is still. You are safe. You are warm. The past cannot follow you here. And as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, remember, evil never starts as evil. It starts as loneliness with nowhere to go. Sleep well, traveler. The story will wait for you when morning comes.
By the summer of 1938, the city hums with unease. Posters urging vigilance, whispers of war creeping across Europe. And yet within the decaying walls of Wool's orphanage, the most important visitor Tom Riddle will ever meet is quietly walking up the front steps, umbrella in hand. You stand beside him now, as Albus Dumbledore, not yet the venerable headmaster, but already radiating that strange mix of patience and power, shakes the rain from his cloak and steps into the building. The matron greets him with the kind of forced politeness reserved for people she doesn't understand. She leads him to the boys' room, her voice low, explaining how odd things happen around that one. Dumbledore listens, but his eyes linger on the cracks in the walls, the faint scent of iron and dust in the air, as if he can already sense the presence of something ancient watching through the shadows.
When Tom enters, Dumbledore notices it immediately, the stillness. Most children fidget or stare, but not this one. Tom studies him, his dark eyes sharp as flint, evaluating rather than greeting. "Good afternoon, Tom," Dumbledore says warmly. "My name is Professor Dumbledore. I've come to tell you that you're a wizard." There's a silence so deep, it feels like time itself pauses. Tom doesn't gasp, doesn't smile. He simply replies, "I knew I was different." You can hear that quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't bloom from surprise, but from confirmation. The matron shifts uneasily. You can almost feel Dumbledore's disappointment, not in the answer itself, but in the absence of wonder. What follows is one of the most unsettling interviews in magical history, an exchange preserved in Dumbledore's later notes, though half the details were conveniently omitted. The boy admits he can make animals obey him. He says he can hurt people when he wants to. and that they deserve it. When Dumbledore warns him against such behavior, Tom smiles and says, "I can make them pay attention. I can make them stop hurting me." It's a child's justification wrapped in the logic of a general. Still, Dumbledore remains calm, producing a flicker of fire in his palm to demonstrate controlled magic. For the first time, Tom's composure falters. His eyes widen, not in fear, but recognition. He senses power greater than his own and hates it instantly. "Can I learn to do that?" he asks, his voice steady but eager. Dumbledore nods. "At Hogwarts, yes, but only if you promise never to use your gift to harm." Tom tilts his head. "Promise?" he repeats, as if tasting the word and finding it foreign. Dumbledore doesn't press him for an answer. Later scholars have spent decades analyzing that meeting, dissecting every phrase. Some claim Dumbledore should have refused him admission, that he saw the darkness but chose mercy. Others argue that excluding him might have made things worse, pushing him deeper into resentment. The most curious fringe theory, however, suggests that Dumbledore's visit awakened something dormant. That by acknowledging Tom's power, he gave it legitimacy, and that perhaps, on some level, the boy's darker impulses were drawn to Dumbledore's light, the way shadows cling tighter when the flame burns brighter. After the meeting, Tom escorts Dumbledore to a locked wardrobe at the back of his room. "I can show you something," he says. The matron protests, but Dumbledore nods. Inside are trophies, stolen trinkets from other children. A yo-yo, a thimble, a tarnished whistle, each labeled neatly with the names of their owners. "Things I've taken from people who've been unkind to me," he explains. His tone is almost proud, but not childish pride, something colder. Dumbledore studies the objects, then looks at the boy. "You will return these," he says quietly, "and you will not steal again." Tom's jaw tightens. "They're mine now." "No," Dumbledore replies, "they were never yours." That's the first time anyone has ever told Tom Riddle no without fear. Years later, Dumbledore would admit that moment stayed with him. That flash of defiance, that thin smile curling at the edges of Tom's mouth, as if he were memorizing the shape of rebellion. And as he leaves the orphanage, he glances once more at the cracked mirror by the door, catching the faintest glimmer of two reflections where there should be one. The summer stretches on, heavy and airless. Tom packs for Hogwarts, his few possessions fitting easily into a small trunk. The matron pretends to be proud, though she avoids his gaze. The other children whisper, relieved he's leaving. But Tom stands at the window the night before departure, staring out into the city's blinking lights. The hum of distant traffic sounds almost like applause. "I knew it," he whispers. "I was never meant to stay here." The reflection in the window nods back, perfectly synchronized. You can almost feel the shift, can't you? That invisible thread tightening between fate and free will. For the first time, Tom Riddle believes the universe is offering him proof that he is special, not chosen by destiny, but self-made. That's far more dangerous. The history books call this the day a wizard's education began. You and I know better. This was the day the orphan found his first audience, the first person to look him in the eye and see both potential and peril, and in doing so, unknowingly lit the spark that would one day consume them both. The steam from the Hogwarts Express curls like breath from a sleeping dragon as you step onto platform 9 3/4 beside the boy who will one day become legend. The chatter of students fills the air, eager, bright, unbroken. But Tom Riddle stands apart, hands clasped neatly behind his back, eyes scanning the scene like a chessboard. This is no adventure to him. It's reconnaissance. The smell of metal, soot, and pumpkin pasties mixes with the faint hum of excitement. And for a moment, you almost forget you're watching someone who's already begun measuring the worth of everyone around him. He boards quietly, finds an empty compartment, and sits perfectly still, as if waiting for the world to make its first move. When the train jerks forward, he doesn't flinch. He just smiles, faint and knowing, as though he's finally on the path he was always meant to walk. The Sorting Hat hesitates longer for Tom Riddle than for almost any student in recent memory. Ambitious, it murmurs. Clever, resourceful, dangerous. The Hat claims to see potential in him for every house except Hufflepuff, because, let's be honest, no amount of kindness was ever going to fit in that skull. When it finally shouts Slytherin, the applause is polite but cautious. Tom lowers his gaze and joins the table, his expression composed. What none of them realize is that he already knows the name Slytherin, already understands that this isn't just a house, but an inheritance waiting to be claimed. At Hogwarts, the world unfolds before him like a puzzle he's been waiting to solve. He excels at charms, masters transfiguration with unsettling precision, and treats defense against the dark arts as if it's a language he's already fluent in. Professors praise his diligence, classmates envy his grace, yet those who share his dormitory whisper that he never sleeps deeply. They say he sometimes murmurs in a strange tongue, soft hissing that makes the curtains tremble. A few brave souls ask about it. Tom dismisses them with a smile so perfect, it almost hides the flicker of contempt behind it. Dumbledore keeps a watchful eye, though even he must admit the boy is remarkable. Once, he finds Tom in the library long after curfew, poring over a massive tome titled Secrets of the Darkest Art. The moment their eyes meet, the book slams shut on its own. Curiosity, Tom says, shrugging, isn't a crime, Professor. Dumbledore's silence in response is long and deliberate. Scholars later debate whether this was the first real confrontation between the two, the moment the serpent and the phoenix recognized one another. Some say Dumbledore saw darkness and hesitated. Others say he saw a child begging for guidance and chose caution over compassion. Either way, the wound between them began here, small and invisible, but destined to grow. You watch him through the seasons, winter nights spent staring into the Black Lake's glassy surface, summer days walking the empty corridors, memorizing every secret passage as though the castle itself were a body he intended to dissect. He becomes a leader among his peers, not through charm, but through gravity. People orbit him without realizing why. He knows what they want to hear, knows when to listen, and most dangerously, knows when to pretend. He collects followers like trinkets, not out of affection, but utility. The Slytherin common room grows quieter when he enters. Even ghosts pause to watch, and yet, there are moments when the mask slips. Once, after winning an award for special services to the school, Tom lingers alone in the trophy room. His reflection glints from 100 polished cups, and you can almost see the hunger flicker behind his eyes. Recognition, he mutters, isn't the same as power. He presses his palm against the glass of a display case, and for a moment, his reflection seems to press back, older and colder. The torch is dim. He blinks, and it's gone. This is the part where the story tightens its grip, because ambition alone doesn't make a monster, but entitlement does. Tom begins to view rules as mere suggestions, morality as a distraction for lesser minds. He discovers that fear commands more loyalty than kindness, and that secrets, properly wielded, are stronger than any spell. His teachers describe him as brilliant but remote, his classmates as kind when he wants to be. You can almost laugh at the understatement. Still, even in his calculated arrogance, there's a haunting kind of beauty in his precision. He studies emotions the way others study runes, cataloging which expressions make people trust him, which pauses make them confess. He once tells a classmate, "People are easy to understand if you stop pretending they're complicated." The classmate laughs, thinking it's a joke. It isn't. And somewhere beneath all this polished intellect lies that same small boy from the orphanage, the one who talked to snakes, who stared into mirrors, who learned that love could not be trusted, but power could be earned. Every triumph reinforces the lesson. Every victory convinces him that destiny isn't written, it's taken. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. So when he looks up at the enchanted ceiling of the great hall one night, the stars reflected in his cold, dark eyes, you can almost hear the thought echoing in his mind, "I will never be ordinary again." And in that quiet vow, whispered beneath 1,000 candles, the legend begins to stir.